You know, there's this unspoken rule in big business: close the plant, keep your head down, and hope that nobody really notices. Maybe a few headlines, a wave of local anger, and then life just goes back to normal for the company anyway. But that's not actually what happened here, because on October 23rd, 2025, just a couple of days ago, General Motors got a shock that didn't come from Wall Street, didn't come from shareholders, and certainly didn't come from the market. It came from Ottawa, from a government that for once decided to bare its teeth. The country GM had treated as a convenient manufacturing outpost just showed that it wasn't going to play that role anymore. And that's what the story is really about. Sure, it is about the 1,200 jobs lost at CAMI and Ingersoll. That's real enough. But beneath it, there is also something much bigger. A moment when a country found its backbone and decided that it wasn't going to be taken for granted by multinational giants. Billions in taxpayers' money, once seen as a blank check, suddenly became real leverage. GM's miscalculation was that it did not just cost them goodwill, it triggered a reaction that reset the whole balance of power. So here's what we're really going to explore in this video. Why do companies think that they can just quietly walk away, no questions asked? What happens when a government, workers, and unions stop begging for crumbs and actually coordinate their power? And how did a single policy move from Ottawa upend decades of corporate playbook, shifting leverage back to people and country? I want to ask those of you watching from Canada, if your government is handing out subsidies to huge multinational corporations, should there be real enforceable consequences when those companies break their word? If you worked at a place like CAMI, would you want to see the government fight for you or just shrug and move on? Let me know what you think in the comments below. Because for once, this is not just a story about lost jobs, it's about whether a country is actually willing to defend itself and the people who live and work there. Just a quick personal note, my new book, Awake, The Practice of Critical Thinking in an Age of Soft Lies, is finally out in the world now. It's more than just a guide to thinking more clearly. It's about finding calm and clarity in a world that keeps getting louder. If you've ever felt like I do, worn down by the noise and knee-jerk opinions and want practical ways to think things through, especially under pressure, I think you'll find it valuable. Or if you know somebody who could use that kind of support right now, it might actually make a thoughtful Christmas gift. There's also a 24-minute companion podcast that walks through the key ideas, plus a launch video and a special discount for subscribers, all linked down below. And one more thing, maybe you didn't know, but I'm a computer scientist and I have a PhD in the field. I'm working on a new course all about AI fluency, essentially making sense of the technology that's shaping the next decade. If you're interested in this space and want to help guide what I build, I'd love to have your input. There's a quick 8-question survey, just a couple of minutes to fill out, and your thoughts will directly influence the content that I build next. The links to everything are below. It would mean so much to hear from you. Thank you for listening, but now let's get back into it. Now, CAMI Assembly is not just a factory. For decades, it was the pulse of Ingersoll, Ontario, a town whose fortunes rose and fell on the rhythm of the assembly line. You could trace generations of families by the shifts they worked. You could chart the town's history by the makes and models rolling out the door. It's the sort of place that's easy to overlook until the silence sets in. In 2022, the CAMI was actually reborn. General Motors declared that it would be Canada's flagship for the electric revolution, retrofitting the aging plant to launch BrightDrop, its new line of electric delivery vans. Newspapers ran optimistic headlines, politicians stood shoulder to shoulder with auto executives, cutting ribbons and promising a renaissance for Canadian industry. Billions in subsidies and incentives flowed from Ottawa and Queen's Park, justified by one clear story that this wasn't just about jobs, it was about securing Canada's seat at the table in North America's green future. For a moment, the pitch actually worked. CAMI would be the first large-scale EV factory in the country. Ontario, battered for years by manufacturing losses, was promised a way back. Workers signed on for retraining, small businesses invested in new equipment, and unions pitched it as the start of a new era. The community believed this, and why wouldn't they, right? The project was designed to last for decades. Everyone from the mayor to the shift foreman could actually see a path forward. But corporate calculus is much colder than political hope. By early 2025, cracks began to show. Demand for the BrightDrop vans was weaker than forecasted. Inventory quietly piled up. And in April, GM hit pause, a temporary suspension of production, a promise to retool and resume. Around 1,200 workers were laid off, the language carefully chosen to imply that it was only a bump in the road. GM said that things would recover. Local leaders tried to believe it. May arrived, but the line still stayed cold, and there was no announcement, no new production target, no vans rolling out. The retooling narrative actually unraveled. The workers who trusted GM's assurances found themselves drifting into uncertainty now, and then without fanfare or even much explanation, October 21st delivered the final blow. The shutdown wasn't temporary, it was total. BrightDrop was finished at CAMI, jobs that had been counted on for a generation gone, or at best dangling in indefinite limbo. You can call it a business decision, sure, but if you were one of those workers or someone whose small businesses depend on those paychecks moving through town, it wasn't just a line in quarterly reports, my friends. It felt like a betrayal, the kind that lingers not just as lost income, but as public humiliation, a breach of trust, a reminder that the system's promises are always conditional in a sense. And in that silence, with the parking lot empty, with families wondering how to pay the mortgage, and with politicians suddenly nowhere to be found, that's where the story really begins. Now, you can almost picture what GM's leadership was actually thinking. Shut down the plant, pay out some severance, maybe issue a carefully worded press release, a bit of noise from the union, a couple of local headlines, and then everything just fades into darkness. In their eyes, it's just the cost of doing business, right? They'd already cashed the government checks after all. They'd stood on the stage beside politicians, promised a bright electric future for CAMI, and took full advantage of the public support. But when the numbers didn't add up fast enough, they seemed to assume that they could just close the doors and move on to another country. And honestly, in a lot of places, that would be the end of it. Company gets the subsidies, shutters the plant, quietly cuts their losses, and hopes that nobody really remembers 6 months later. Maybe GM thought that Canadian politicians wouldn't have the stomach for a real fight, who knows? Maybe they assumed taxpayers wouldn't care, or that the media would move on to the next crisis. Maybe they just figured nobody would have the will to actually hold them to account. But here is where they seriously misread the moment, because on October 21st, when GM announced the shutdown was permanent, Ottawa didn't just mutter around disappointment. They didn't blink at all. Instead, they hit back, and they hit back harder than anyone at GM actually expected. This is where Mélanie Joly, with a similar hairstyle to mine, stepped in. Canada's industry minister, and frankly the last person GM wanted to hear from. Within days of GM's shutdown announcement, Joly and the federal government said enough. They made it clear the system of subsidies and exemptions wasn't just a pile of free money for them, it was a binding agreement, and GM had actually broken it. So Ottawa didn't just talk tough, they actually acted. They slashed GM's tariff-free import quota by over 24%. For Stellantis, who had also shifted production out of Canada, the cut was even deeper, a 50% reduction. Suddenly moving jobs south of the border didn't just mean awkward headlines, it meant a huge hit to the bottom line. This was not some symbolic gesture or a bit of political theater here. This was a real serious economic muscle, the kind that actually forces a company to reconsider its options seriously. Ottawa's message was brutally simple. If you want the benefits, you actually have to keep your promises. You invest, you create jobs here, or those privileges disappear. At the same time, Joly set up a special response team as well. She called GM to the table and gave them a deadline, 15 days to come up with a real detailed plan for what happens next at CAMI. Not some vague promise, not another empty press release, an actual roadmap with dates and specifics. For Ottawa, this was not about revenge or scoring points. It was about setting a principle. You cannot take Canadian support and then abandon Canadian workers without facing consequences. It's just not how it works. For the people of Ingersoll, it was more than policy, it was just leverage. It was hope that for once the government might actually have their back. And it does. At least it seems like it does. Now, the effect was actually immediate. GM missed the government's 15 deadline. No new production plan emerged. The CAMI plant remained idle. Dealers in Canada and the US started feeling ripple effects. For GM vehicles built in the US and imported into Canada, the tariff-free pipeline was throttled. Suddenly, the cost calculations shifted dramatically. For Stellantis, facing a 50% quota cut, the decision looked even starker. The cost of moving production out of Canada under such a regime had just surged, and analysts now are saying that the strategy is working. By turning regulatory tools into credible threats, Ottawa has actually introduced real economic pain into decisions corporations once treated as costless. GM and peers are essentially forced to rethink, is abandoning Canadian production still worth it? The thing is, this story is not just about a single plant or any shiny electric van or even 1,200 pink slips. It's about something much bigger, something that actually touches the lives of people you'll never see quoted in a press release. For years, Canadian workers have known this feeling. You put your whole life into a job, you build your community around a factory, And yet all it takes is a shift in some spreadsheet 1,000 miles away and the rug gets pulled from under you. Multinational automakers have treated places like Ingersoll as chess pieces, easy to move, easy to replace, as if humans are not actually involved in these decisions. If the numbers are good, you get jobs. If costs go up, you get closure. It always felt like the real power was somewhere else, but suddenly the script has changed now. For the first time in generations, Ottawa is using its leverage to essentially say, if you want public support, if you want tariff-free access to our market, then you actually have to show some real respect for Canadian workers, actual accountability, not just PR fluff. And for people living through this, families in Ingersoll, single parents trying to cover rent, local businesses hanging by a thread, this is more than just a headline, my friends. Is the government actually showing that their lives, their stability actually matter in the grand calculus of industry? For once, the policy is not just a soundbite, it has teeth. It can actually force a company to make a choice, either come back or pay the price. So yes, for the big auto players, it is a warning. Canada is not just a backdrop for corporate chess moves anymore. And for ordinary people, it's a small but significant sign that the rules might finally be shifting in their favor. And maybe, the days of being taken for granted are actually over. As of right now, GM still hasn't managed to come up with any real plan for what's next at CAMI. There's talk, there are meetings, but nothing is actually concrete yet. Meanwhile, Stellantis, the other big name in the story, is already facing formal dispute proceedings from Ottawa for moving production out of Canada. In other words, the government is not just threatening action, they're actually following through with it. And here's what's really interesting to me. The entire North American auto industry is watching all of this, probably with more than a little anxiety. Companies that used to call the shots are now seeing governments actually use their regulatory muscle, not as a fit of chaos, but in a deliberate, strategic way. It's leverage, plain and simple. Suddenly, policy is not just paperwork, it's real pressure. And the balance of power is tilting, even if just a little, towards communities instead of boardrooms. The big question now isn't even whether GM will bring production back to Ingersoll. The deeper question, in my opinion, the one that matters for a lot more people, is whether this is the beginning of a new standard. Is Canada and maybe other countries too finally willing to demand real accountability from the corporations that they support? Or is this just a one-off moment, a flash of backbone before the old habits return? That's the shift to watch for, because what started at CAMI could actually end up rewiring the rules for everyone as well. Companies often talk about bonding with communities, investing in local jobs, building a future. But what if that future is unilaterally terminated the moment the bottom line doesn't actually shine like it used to? It turns out that's not a costless decision, not anymore, because when a government shows it's willing to follow through, not just with words, but with real economic consequences, the game shifts, my friends. And for workers, for towns, for countries, it might just mark the end of corporate impunity. I don't know whether CAMI will ever roar back to life. But I know this, the message sent by Canada was not about mercy or politics, it was about principle, and sometimes principle lands heavier than any subsidy ever could. What do you think though? Should governments everywhere treat corporate subsidies like binding contracts? Or is this kind of intervention a dangerous overstep? Leave your thoughts below in the comments. If this kind of thinking resonates with you, if you want to understand how to navigate the noise, the hype, and the complexity of our current moment, I think you'd really enjoy my book. It's called Awake, the Practice of Critical Thinking in an Age of Self-Lies. And it's written for people who want to stay grounded, think clearly, and live in reality even when the world makes that feel impossible. I've also included a 24-minute podcast episode where we unpack some of the ideas behind Awake in a more relaxed, conversational way, perfect if you prefer to listen while walking, driving, or just taking a break from screens. You'll find the link down below. I'd love to know what you think of all of it. As always, thank you for being here and for thinking through these questions with me. If you like the conversation, do consider subscribing for more, and don't forget to check out these other videos that I've linked here as a natural next step for a deeper dive.